Deepwoken has a weapon problem. And no, I'm not talking about the oversaturation of legendary weapons. Deepwoken's weapons are just poorly balanced in both PvE and PvP, and don't fit the progression systems that are in the game. Make sure to subscribe since only about 20% of the people watching this video right now are actually subscribed. Now let's get straight into it. Deepwoken's weapons all have requirements and stats which dictate whether they're early, medium, or late game weapons. But there are a few problems with this type of system being in Deepwoken. First of all being the irrelevance of early and medium game weapons throughout progression. The second being the lack of standardization and strength across endgame weapons. Starting with the first issue, Deepwoken has weapon rarities which will generally increase in stat requirements per rarity up until you can use them. This system is in place to make it so as you progress, your weapon can progress and strengthen with you, but this is really flawed in Deepwoken for a few reasons. First of all, the progression is just too quick for it to really matter. If you're progressing a build nowadays, most people just stick with their starter weapon for a majority of it, maybe use a mid-game weapon just because they happen to find one and be at that stat point, and then they end up with their final weapon of choice by the end of their progression. This sounds fine on paper, but it really isn't, because your weapon is actually one of the lowest limiting factors for strength in both PvE and PvP at this point in the game, where you won't have your final weapon. In PvE, most of your strength scales with stats and power level. A power 20 with a base sword is still going to run down a Sharko in like 5 seconds. A power 1 with a crit blade, if possible, wouldn't have that scaling and still be substantially weaker despite having a much stronger weapon. So as far as PvE goes, your weapon scaling as you strengthen doesn't matter because you already get more than enough scaling to usually mostly invalidate that. And before anyone brings up the point of being in endgame dungeons like Diluvian mechanism, you're not going to be using lower weapons for that anyway. So I guess in those situations it matters, but your build's done by the time you're doing Diluvian mechanism. Now, the game doesn't require or really incentivize you to upgrade as you go through PvP either, because if you're progressing your build properly nowadays, your weapon stat always comes last in the progression because of talents, which means you'll usually have your base weapon until like 70% of the way through your progression regardless, and if you're fighting someone, you'll just have to outskill them. Now, why is this a problem? Because the game has way too many irrelevant weapons. Early and mid-game weapons are all useless. Now you might be thinking, well, they're for the early and mid-game, so they should be useless in the end game. The problem with that is that there's not enough early or mid-game weapons to make them relevant in the early and mid-game. You're just going to be using your base sword. And the PvE scaling makes this worse, right? A good example of weapon upgrade through progression is surprisingly Minecraft. You start with a wooden or usually a stone sword early on and kill simple mobs. Then you'll upgrade to iron and start killing stuff like endermen and maybe blazes in the nether, which signifies the mid-game. And then you ideally have a diamond sword by the ender dragon fight, at which point you'll beat that. Each weapon has its place and its progress point, and you upgrade as you go naturally because you're going to be needing those resources anyway. In Deepwoken, you usually go straight from base sword to final weapon through progression. And I don't think they should make the progressions longer to validate these weapons, but the game just has too many weapons with no uses, and no, alloys don't really help this issue. Most alloyed weapons are still worse than the meta endgame weapons because of the second point I wanted to bring up. There is no standardization for this game's weapon balancing. Weapons don't have matching DPS or utility standards. Two weapons of the same type, both meant for endgame, could have completely different DPS values. It's also the reason why every time a new weapon launches, it is usually terribly unbalanced. Remember the wretched mob blades on release, doing 340 damage on guard break? Well, since they have no standardization for weapon DPS or even for weapon posture, there's just no standards here. This is why the weapons were doing 340 damage per guard break. If the devs try to standardize weapons based on their main purpose and focus on that, then there'd be way better balancing. The way I'd probably do it is based on one of 3 weapon purposes. First off, normal weapons, which are just based on damage per hit, made to be played in a way where you'd land normal amounts of hits. Second being posture-based weapons. Think of the Hive Lord's Hubris and most of the Great Hammers, where you'd probably be focusing on baiting blocks, so that way you could get a guard break. And then fast pressure-based weapons, which focus on pressuring your shaky block and spamming M1 any chance they get. Then from these 3, separate every weapon into these categories and balance their DPS values to average levels within a few damage of each other, accounting for their specialization. The Hive Lord's Hubris is slow. Make sure it's doing a lot of damage on those guard breaks and doing a lot of posture damage. Daggers are fast and should be doing less damage per swing, obviously, but they should also have less startups to make spamming M1 easier. right? Because that's what you dagger players love to do. There is no standard DPS values for Deepwokens, so we end up with weapons that just dominate the meta every week, and then we have so many weapons that they get reverse power crept after a nerf because the devs hate buffing things. When was the last time you saw someone using Pale Morning? Well, actually probably pretty recently, because it's actually half decent now. But for a while, Petra's Anger was the most dominant Great Hammer for like a year until Great Maul and the Pale Morning Ally started to come back in, which even the Pale Morning Alloy never made it as good as it was back in the early day. But that's fine, right? Because at least it's kind of viable now, and a side grade to the Great Maul. The point I'm making is that the devs kind of just gotta let people use what they want within reason. I shouldn't be forced to use one Great Hammer over another because they're both endgame weapons, right? And then they'll have like a small difference in stats that'll just make one have slightly higher DPS, damage, posture, whatever. And I get you're not forced to, but you get outclassed if you don't, and that's lame. If one weapon's faster, make the other one do slightly more damage and make their DPS values equal. If the devs won't balance every weapon to a standard, at least balance weapons within a category, and then have stuff like bleed damage be trade-offs for less raw damage since it bypasses armor and stuff. Real quick, I just want to play a little game with you guys in the comments down below. I want you guys to guess what percentage of weapons are considered endgame weapons, and then what percentage of weapons are viable in the current PvP meta, which I didn't compile this information myself because I'm a bit out of the PvP meta, but I did get most of it from Godseeker players. Now, I'll give you guys a few seconds to confirm your answers down below as I talk into your ears all nice and smooth. And done. Now, to make the numbers even better, I only considered alloyed weapon variants and not their originals. So out of 200 or so weapons currently in the game, 51% of them, or 102 weapons, are considered endgame weapons as far as requirements and usage go. Out of all of those weapons in the game, only 36 of them are even considered semi-viable in PvP or PvE. And I added PvE weapons too because I felt like, you know, the count would be even more unfair, but that's still just 18% of weapons. And I might have double counted a few of them. I think I put Ice Hero Blade in the tracker by like 3 times, which even then I say semi-viable because it's support builds, but realistically, if I were being harsher on this, Ice Hero Blade wouldn't be in here. And then I guess Storm's Eye, but there's no other half-decent rifles, I don't think. Regardless, half of the game's weapons are dedicated to the late game, and less than half of those weapons are considered viable today. All because the devs like to nerf weapons and then forget about them rather than adjusting weapons to fit into the meta because nerf and go is just easier. And the worst part is, this doesn't apply to just weapons, it also applies to mantras. The easiest way to show this off is probably with Frostdraw, because I feel like there's the most bad mantras in Frostdraw. But there's like 5 good mantras, and the rest are kind of just useless and nobody uses them. It's so bad, in fact, that most people just crutch on Ice Lance, Ice Smash, and Rising Frost. I am people. Regardless, why are there like 5 viable mantras and then like 13 that nobody ever uses? Even Ice Blade is bad, which is probably just because the devs didn't make it like Fire Blade and try to be unique with it, and that didn't pay off well, but still, there's just too much stuff in this game that exists just to exist rather than being a usable side grade. Everyone using every attunement runs the same mantras across them because the rest aren't good enough to fill a purpose and the attunements aren't varied enough. But that doesn't mean the current best mantras should be nerfed, it means that the other ones should be given more value and use cases. And back to what I was saying about weapons in the early and mid game being useless, it would actually be cool if, I don't know, maybe there was some sort of use to them. Maybe early and mid game weapons could be used to temporarily boost your stats until you got to the late game weapons, which would still have better stats. I just don't really think that your build itself and your armor should matter more when it comes to doing damage in PvE specifically. Like, more so for PvE than PvP, because I think PvP weapons matter more, right? Like, your weapon is very important in PvP versus in PvE where it's really just which crit do you want? Do you want something that specializes in posture damage or AoEs, which is kind of lame, especially when they added Ashes of War where you could like change the crits around. But I think that your weapon should make more of a difference in PvE, because right now the biggest factors are your power level. So if you're power 20, you're going to be doing the most damage to monsters to the point where usually you can run through most things, even if you don't have like the best PvE weapon. And then your armor kits with like damage versus monsters on them, which is like, why is my armor a bigger play and a bigger advantage because of the stats on it than my weapon? It's stupid. They really should be prioritizing weapons more, because it doesn't make sense that my armor is a bigger contributing factor in my PvE build than weapons. And for PvP, this can't really be helped because obviously weapons are important in PvP. They do more damage and you want more damage. And you could say the same about PvE, but it's not a majorly contributing factor, which is why there's more side grades in PvE than PvP, but things are still stricter because the meta just revolves around your armor stats. I don't know, man. It's really hard to balance them when the game isn't really based on its progression anymore, because it's not a lore or PvE based game, and it hasn't been in a long time. The game revolves around PvP, which means all that matters is where your build ends up in the end, not the journey leading to power 20, because none of that ever matters anymore. To be fair, none of it ever really did matter, because if you look at layer 2, that's an endgame dungeon. And there's a lot of endgame content in the game that just kind of like makes it so early and mid-game are invalidated. Now, I don't think that there shouldn't be a lot of endgame content. I think most of the content should be in the endgame because the progression is so fast, but it kind of doesn't make up for the fact that, like, there's no different content for the medium and like low level players or even like the new players, because once you get to a certain point, you have to do layer 2. Once you get to a certain point in PvP, you have to do Chime of Conflict, I guess. Once you get to a certain point in PvE, you do Diluvian Mechanism and Hell Mode. But then in the early game, it's really just go kill stuff in various areas, and then there's no real quests, which is kind of lame. Which, I mean, I also kind of wanted Deepwoken to have more quests. That would have been cool. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you agreed on any of the points, would like to add on to anything, or if you disagree, then just let me know down in the comments below. Try and change my mind. Shoutouts to YouTube members Goobka, Brick, Pickle, Highcard, Bacon, and Drizzy Drake Fan. Hope you all have an amazing day. Watch the live channel. I love you, and goodbye.